Florence, the city that invented the Renaissance. Imagine a city where bankers shaped art, where merchants financed genius, where politics, commerce, and creativity collided to create something the world had never seen before. In the 1400s, Florence wasn't the biggest city in Europe, it wasn't the richest, and it certainly wasn't the most peaceful, but somehow, this turbulent Italian republic became the intellectual dynamo of the Renaissance, producing giants like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo Brunelleschi, and Machiavelli. So how did one city produce such an explosion of creativity? The answer lies in money, politics, pride, and a fiercely competitive culture. And once you understand Florence, you understand the Renaissance itself. The most creative city in Europe. Florence wasn't just another Italian city. From the early 1300s to the mid-1500s, it produced an extraordinary concentration of intellectual talent. Poets like Dante, writers like Boccaccio and Machiavelli, artists like Giotto Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci, sculptors like Donatello and Michelangelo. Florence became a laboratory of ideas, a place where artistic and political experiments were constantly being tested. And if a brilliant artist wasn't born in Florence, they often moved there. Painters like Raphael and Piero della Francesca came to Florence specifically to learn and develop their style. As people at the time joked, they came to dip their clothes in the art, the river that runs through Florence, hoping to absorb the city's creative energy. But creativity doesn't appear out of nowhere. Something about Florence made genius flourish, and it starts with geography. The perfect location. Florence sits along the Arno River, surrounded by hills and mountain passes. That location gave it something incredibly valuable in medieval Europe: trade routes. Goods could move west along the river and through mountain passes toward the rest of Europe. Trade meant money, and money meant growth. By the late Middle Ages, Florence expanded rapidly, building larger and larger defensive walls as the population increased. By the 1300s, the city had around 120,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. But Florence wasn't just growing, it was becoming rich. And that wealth came from two industries that powered the Renaissance: wool and banking. The wool industry that funded art. Florence's economy was built on wool. Raw wool arrived from places like England and Spain. Then Florentine workers transformed it into luxury cloth, sold all across Europe. The process was incredibly complex. Sorting, cleaning, carding, spinning, warping, weaving. Nearly 30 different steps were required before wool became finished cloth. At its peak, the industry employed about 30,000 workers, an enormous workforce for a medieval city. Florentine cloth was famous for its bright colors and quality, and it was exported everywhere, even to Persia and China. This massive industry created a powerful merchant class, and these merchants organized themselves into groups called guilds. The power of the guilds. By the Renaissance, Florence had 21 major guilds. 7 of them were especially powerful. They represented industries like wool manufacturing, silk trade, banking, medicine, law, retail trade. These guilds didn't just regulate business, they controlled politics. Members of the guilds ran Florence's government and shaped its policies. This meant Florence was essentially ruled by wealthy businessmen rather than kings or nobles, and that created a unique political system. Florence was a merchant republic. In theory, the city was governed by elected officials. In practice, power shifted constantly between competing families. Florence was famous for conspiracies, assassinations, exiles, political coups. Yet despite all this chaos, something remarkable happened. The system kept functioning, and that stability allowed culture to flourish. The Medici family. No family shaped Florence more than the Medici. They started as bankers, but they eventually became the most powerful political force in the city. The Medici Bank, founded in 1397, grew into one of the largest financial institutions in Europe. It had branches in Rome, Venice, Milan, Geneva, Bruges, London. The Medici handled deposits, loans, international transfers, and trade. They even managed the financial affairs of the papacy. This immense wealth gave them enormous political influence. But the Medici were more than bankers. They were patrons of art. They funded churches, sculptures, paintings, architecture. For example, records show that Cosimo de' Medici spent over 663,000 florins on buildings, charities, and public works. A staggering amount of money at the time. Why spend so much? Partly for religion, partly for reputation, and partly because in Florence, art was political propaganda. Why Florence created great art. Florence had something unique, a large class of wealthy, educated citizens who wanted art. They bought it for churches, they bought it for public buildings, they bought it to show off their wealth and influence. And this constant demand created competition among artists. Painters and sculptors had to impress patrons who were knowledgeable and demanding. At the same time, Florentine merchants valued realism and precision. They lived in a world of numbers, contracts, and profits. They understood value in concrete terms. That mindset carried into art. Florence became the birthplace of realistic painting and sculpture. Artists focused on accurate anatomy, perspective, realistic portraiture. Florence was the first place where wealthy patrons insisted on being painted exactly as they looked. No idealized saints, no symbolic figures, real people, real faces. And this realism became one of the defining features of Renaissance art. Art as civic pride. Florence didn't just produce art for beauty, it used art to promote the city itself. Artists were sent abroad like cultural ambassadors. Florentine rulers recommended painters and architects to kings and popes. Lorenzo de' Medici even helped arrange commissions for artists in places like Naples and Rome. Florence also celebrated its artists publicly. Monuments were built to famous creators. Books praised the city's cultural achievements. Florentines believed their city represented the rebirth of classical civilization. They compared themselves to ancient Rome, and they genuinely believed Florence was leading Europe into a new age. Conclusion: why Florence changed history. So why did the Renaissance happen in Florence? Because the city had the perfect combination of forces. Trade created wealth, guilds created political power, banks financed massive projects, merchants demanded art, patrons rewarded innovation, and a fierce sense of civic pride pushed artists to compete for greatness. Florence believed in human ability, in the power of intelligence, creativity, and ambition. One Florentine writer proudly declared, "Nothing is beyond the powers of the Florentines," and for a moment in history, that statement almost felt true. Because in one small Italian city, human creativity exploded, launching the Renaissance and shaping the modern world. If you enjoyed this, I am making an entire series about the Renaissance, so like and subscribe to make sure you catch them all. Also let me know where you are and what you want to see next.